Thank you to all of you who are joining this meeting. We'll be starting at exactly 11:05 so that we can give an opportunity to those who are joining the meeting to settle in. We'll be starting this meeting at exactly 11:05 so that we give a chance to those who are joining the meeting to settle in. Thank you. Thank you to all of you who are joining this meeting. When we start in the next 1 minute, we are just giving a chance to those who are joining the meeting to quickly settle in. Thank you. Welcome to the Business Benchmark on Farm Animal Welfare webinar. My name is Beth Njeri, the Digital Content Officer at World Animal Protection. Today, we train our focus on highlighting the state of farm animal welfare globally. Leading this discussion is Dr. Victor Yamo. He's the Farming Campaigns Manager at World Animal Protection. Victor is an animal welfare enthusiast with over 20 years experience in farming systems. Throughout his presentation, he'll take us through the state of farm animal welfare standards within the world's largest production companies and why your consumer voice is crucial to ensuring improved farm animal welfare globally. Let's take this conversation global through the hashtag BBFAW, hashtag BBFAW, as it was shown in the screen earlier. And our Twitter handle is at Move the World AF. Just before we kick off, we'll pop up a 3-poll question just to gauge your understanding on animal welfare. This will be up for about 2 minutes, so kindly ensure that you select your answers quickly. The results will be shared at the end of the webinar, so it will give you an opportunity to know whether you were right or wrong. So please stick to the end of this webinar. We'll also have a Q&A session after the presentation by Victor. So please type in your thoughts and questions in the Q&A box, and we'll endeavor to pick your question and ask to our main presenter of the day. Shortly after the webinar, we'll also have a 15-minute session for all media stakeholders in this webinar. Should you have any questions related to news articles you'd like to put together, that will be an opportunity for you to interact with our main panelist for the day. So to kick us off, let's start with the poll. Please make sure that you participate and have your voice heard. Thank you. Just to take you through the question, the first question is, do you think the welfare of an animal can affect the safety and quality of the food on your plate? It's a yes and no question. The second one is, choose instances where animal welfare is not violated. In this instance, you are supposed to select any of which you think applies, and it can be more than one. And in our last question is, if any, are you aware of existing animal protection laws in your country? It's a yes or no question. Take your time. Like I said, the answers will be shared at the end of this webinar. We'll stop at exactly 11 minutes, at exactly 11:10. Thank you to everyone who has participated in our poll. We'll now move to the main presenter, Dr. Victor Yamo. Over to you. Thank you.
terms of use in animals, and then use of both substances that promote substances, then use of genetically modified cloned animals, routine mutilations, pre-slaughter management, and then the final one is around transportation. Next. So the aims and the objectives of BBFAW, the main objective is to drive higher farm animal welfare standards in world-leading food businesses. There are three aims, which I will not elaborate at this point because they are available for you to look at. I would like to move to the next slide, where next slide. BBFAW is actually supported by Compassion in Wild Farming and also Wild Animal Protection. That's why we are interested in it. It is not supported by the food industry, so that there is no conflict of interest in that process. I will then quickly move into the actual report, the highlights of the report. The highlight of the report, in terms of the report, that is the cover of business benchmark for farm animal welfare. The 2019 highlights include one. This is the 8th annual report. Yeah. All right. So we start from the beginning? Yes, okay.
We apologize for the technical hitch. We are working on this and should be fixed in quite a bit. Victor will start from the beginning for all those who are not able to catch the presentation. We apologize. Our technical team is just quickly working on his audio so that he's able to jump back. We are sorry for this. Thank you. In the meantime, we'll play the video on what the business benchmark for farm animal welfare is.
You are muted.
Sasa, unanisikia Evans? You can hear me now.
Sasa unamsikia? Unamsikia kwa sasa?
Yes.
All right, Victor, we are waiting for your video and presentation. We can see you. We just need to see your presentation up.
Thank you, Beth.
Yes, we can see your presentation and can hear you clearly. Thank you, Victor. Continue with the presentation.
Where we are discussing what animal welfare is. And animal welfare means the physical and mental state of an animal in relation to the condition in which the animal dies, which is the World Organization for Animal Health definition. An animal is also said to be in a good state of welfare if it is healthy, comfortable, well-nourished, safe, and not suffering from unpleasant states such as pain, fear, and distress. Freedom number one is freedom from hunger and thirst, which is essentially ensuring that the animal has food and water. Freedom essentially about the environment from pain, which means the animal to be cut out in terms of disease and injury. Then we must allow the animal to express normal behavior, and finally, having done a brief on animal welfare, I think we will then move to business benchmark for farm animal welfare, the introduction. Business benchmark, BBFAW as it's called, is a global public ranking of the world's leading food companies for farm animal welfare. Ranking is based on publicly available information on companies' farm animal welfare policies, practices, and performance, which essentially just means looking at what is their then provides an annual review for how major food companies are managing and reporting their approach to farm animal welfare and allowing them to make farm animal welfare a critical business issue. Yeah. The benchmark has 7 key farm animal welfare related issues that it looks like. One is close confinement, which is about space, and critical to that is battery cage systems. The second thing is use of antibiotics prophylactically, which is how we use antibiotics in production systems, which is a big thing in the world currently. The next one is use of growth promoting substances and the use of genetically modified cloned animals, then routine mutilations, teeth clipping in pigs, tail docking in pigs, pre-slaughter stunning, and how long the animal travels during transportation. The aims and objectives of BBFAW are essentially to drive higher farm animal welfare standards in world's leading food business. And I think the important thing to understand is that the business is around retailers, around producers, and around producers of food globally. And we are looking at the big ones. The BBFAW is supported by compassion in farm wild animal protection. Next. And having said that, then I will move straight to the highlights of the benchmark for 2019. On the screen is the 2019 cover. So 2019, there is the 8th annual report. It looks at 150 global food companies that includes 52 retailers, 63 producers, and 35 restaurants, 70 from Europe, 52 from North America, and the rest from Australia, Brazil, China, Japan, New Zealand, and Thailand. I know there will be questions why there's none in Africa, but as you can see in the spread there, basically the reason being that the accreditation criteria then cuts off most of the African companies, because you're looking at 50 of the largest retailers globally that at least have an excess of $10 billion annual revenues. We're looking at the 40 top global producers, which who have a turnover of at least $4.6 billion, and the top 30 restaurants and bars globally. The report, the highlights are as follows. The first is around farm animal welfare leadership and improved management practices are increasingly becoming institutionalized. Having looked at the report over the last 8 years, 60% of the world's largest food companies are actually focusing efforts to ensure that farm animal welfare is effectively handled. The report also shows that 87% of the companies acknowledge that farm animal welfare is a relevant business issue, which is very important. Next, the second thing is that the pace of change is accelerating. Companies are increasingly recognizing farm animal welfare as an integral part of their business and strategy. For example, 80% of the companies have moved at least one tier, and we'll explain the tiers in the next slide, because we have 6 tiers, but as companies progress up on the tiers, then we are able to see progress. So 80% of the companies have at least moved one tier. In terms of policies for animal welfare, we have 25% of the companies that were reviewed have universal policies, which means the policies cover the whole globe. Then 50% have partial policies, which means that 75% of the companies actually have
farm animal welfare practices in place, policies in place. In terms of evolution, we started off with about 64 companies, and we are now looking at 150 companies. And you can see the lower tier, the one which looks almost pinkish, is the lowest, the tier 5 and 6, where there is no policies. The middle one, tier 4 and 3, is where they've recognized these policies and they've started working on them. And the top tier, tier 1 and 2, are the ones where policies are in place and they're being driven. And essentially, you can see that companies have begun working on that. The third highlight is that companies are now working to ensure that farm animal welfare management systems are in place and are effective. 75% of the companies have set farm animal welfare related objectives and targets that they are looking at and following up. And 50% of the companies report that they include farm animal welfare in their supplier contracts. So you can see it's something that is becoming important. It's not just about the company having farm animal welfare policies, but it's also being driven through the whole value chain. In terms of number 4, companies are now prioritizing action on close confinement and non-therapeutic use of antibiotics. And I think those are the two big things that the world is looking at: use of antibiotics and how close animals are being kept. Animals being kept too close will lead to disease situations, and that's why the spacing becomes important. And as you can see on the left, about 67% of the companies have commitments that they are going to ensure that policies are in place and they are going to give animals enough space. On the right is non-therapeutic antibiotic use policies, and you can see about 65% of the companies have policies in place, some universal covering the whole globe and some covering partial commitments in certain geographical locations. 97% of global food companies are also, 97 out of the 150 companies have also made commitments to reduce or to avoid use of antibiotics routinely in a market or in across the markets that they operate in, which is very critical because antibiotics is becoming a very important thing in terms of ensuring that production is managed in a holistic way and that food that comes out are not going to have any antibiotic residues. Also, it's a health issue that needs to be looked at. In terms of growth promotion, universally, there's been commitment from 12% of the companies that they will not be using growth promoting substances. And again, if you look across Europe and in the developed world, the use of growth promoting substances is being reduced. The next highlight is management systems and processes appear to be delivering better welfare outcomes for farm animals, but the progress is slow. And the reason why we are saying it's slow is 69% of the companies have some animal welfare performance data, but most of that data is not holistic and it is scattered across their production systems. 59% of the companies are also reporting that report farm animal welfare at either senior management level, showing that farm animal welfare is becoming important because it's an operational and senior management issue. Food companies are also starting to address systemic challenges to drive higher welfare standards within their production systems. 78% of the companies are now adding animal welfare expertise to their teams so that the team has people who have understanding and they can appreciate animal welfare. And 68% of the companies are partnering with industry stakeholders to advance animal welfare policies and practices. What is driving this thing? And one of the things that has come out, there are 4 things that are driving farm animal welfare by global food companies. One is tightening regulatory requirements of animal welfare, food safety, and quality. We want to know how food companies are actually managing farm animal welfare because there are risks that would get into the supply chains. And the big one for world animal protection is the fact that there's consumer interest in food quality, safety, provenance, and traceability. Essentially, people are looking at safety of food and ensure that it's traceable through the system. And last but not least, food scandals, which are essentially things that we've seen happening, people adding antibiotics or people adding preservatives or chemicals to food that has then brought issues. I then want to now just highlight 2 examples, one retailer and one restaurant, on what they're actually doing and then discuss how that impacts on the African situation. I will start with the restaurant known as Carrefour or Carrefour, which is collaborating with the laboratory do innovation territorial leads in animal welfare and the use of antibiotics. As I said, antibiotics are not supposed to be in food. And so the driving force that Carrefour is the first that they want to ensure that they're with antibiotics-free food. The second thing they're looking at is the cage-free egg production, which a lot of international companies have committed to eliminating by 2023. The question then is, those are positions that are internationally, but are those positions also being addressed in Africa? Are those animal welfare positions being driven in Africa? Just to give you examples, you can see that Carrefour is doing audits for abattoirs to ensure that the slaughter is of humane and meets certain international standards. And that was done last year. They actually went through reviewing abattoirs that they were using across 84 abattoirs in the country. The second example that I'm going to use is a restaurant, also known Yam Brands, also known as KFC. And you can see that last year in July, KFC in the UK made commitments to better chicken commitment, which is about ensuring that chickens don't grow too fast, that they have enough space, and there's no antibiotics being used in that process. Immediately after the UK commitment, 6 other countries then signed on better chicken commitment in Europe, including Belgium, Netherlands, Sweden, and UK. The question then again is, are those commitment, the better chicken commitments being seen in the African context, where you find KFC is one of the big international brands that is working in Africa. And those are some of the reasons why we are then saying it is important for the African continent to start looking at standards coming from elsewhere and demands in the business in Africa. In terms of the way forward, we are saying that we need to encourage global companies to improve their practices in reporting on farm animal welfare with emphasis on consumer education. Because if you have an enlightened consumer, they're then able to ensure that they ask the right question at the retail level, and that then pushes the retailers to do the right thing. That is already happening in the developed world, and we are looking at how, as World Animal Protection, having an office in Africa, we can expand the same to cover the franchises in Africa. We are hence therefore working with some of these global brands to ensure that the same commitments they've made out there is happening in Africa. The second thing is companies are also collaborating with stakeholders, especially intergovernmental agencies, standards bodies, and financial institutions to develop animal welfare policies and standards. And at that process, we are trying to encourage them to integrate BBFAW into the requirements of the standards that are being created. And as we work with industry in Africa, in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia, and across the continent, that is one of the things we are looking at. How do we then ensure that the standards and the policies that are being developed are in line with the international standards that the companies have made commitment to elsewhere? Finally, it's also increasing emphasis on improving farm animal welfare performance within the benchmark itself, and feedback coming from you and the rest of us will help us to ensure that the next benchmark will have better results and will be driving companies to the next level. Thank you.
All right, Victor, thank you for your presentation. Indeed, very well detailed and clear. And thank you for everyone who has sent in their questions. We'll pick a few questions in the interest of time, just because so many questions have come in and we really don't have too much time on our hands, especially with the delays at the beginning. So Victor, we have a question from Austin. Austin is asking, is there a time frame to set the end application and usage of chemicals such as pesticides and antibiotics in relation to the availability of sufficient alternative biopesticides? Is there a time frame to stop the application and usage of chemicals such as antibiotics and pesticides in relation to the availability of sufficient alternative biopesticides? Question by Austin Makani.
Thank you, Austin, for that question. Various countries in Africa are in the process of developing certain policies with certain timelines. For instance, if we start from the known, if you look at Europe, Europe has already banned use of certain antibiotics in farm animal production systems. They've banned use of growth promoting chemicals. And they're slowly starting to look at alternatives because of the situation we have with antimicrobial resistance. In Africa, what has happened is certain African countries have then developed certain policies, legislations, work plans that are then looking at how we can then move out of that process. National strategy for the reduction of antibiotics and also a work plan around that. And part of that process is then it's a phased approach. We are looking at how we can work around that over the next 5 target being by 2030, most of those chemicals should not be in place. But it's country by country, I would like to say that. And it is important to understand that each countries are at different stages of developing some of this legislation or policies that we are looking at. But companies, the interesting thing is corporates have then gone ahead. The corporates that I've worked around with in the African context, some of the producers here have already banned the use of antibiotics in their production systems. As far as I know, growth promoting substances were not allowed in the production system in many of the African countries, and that has been legislated. So that's what we need to be looking at. And I think part of it is then to raise consumer awareness so that consumers can also be helping us drive some of these processes. Thank you, Austin. I hope that answers you.
I believe that answers. Austin also had another interesting question. He asked if in Kenya we have standards that can enable farm animal farmers to follow when they are raising farm animals such as chicken, pigs, and that kind of thing. Is there something they can look up to in regards to standards to enable them become better animal keepers and breeders?
Thank you, Austin. Again, very interesting question. I want to answer it at 2 levels. One, if you go to the corporate sector, and I alluded to the fact that corporates have been slightly ahead. If you go to corporate sector, the big producers in this country, for pigs and poultry and even dairy, they would have standards that you can work around. They will tell you about housing, the spaces that you need, what you need to feed, and all that. However, last year, the Kenya Bureau of Standards working with industry developed a farm animal welfare standard that you can easily access from the Kenya Bureau of Standards offices in Nairobi or nearest to you. So there is documentation around what industry has developed and what government has developed as Kenya Bureau of Standards. I think what we need to do is then to make the general public and the farmers aware that those standards are available. It's only that what we need to do is to legislate them so that they have the full backing of law. Because as you realize, what industry has developed is an industry extension document, and it's not a legal document as is required by, that can take somebody to court.
Thank you, Victor, for that. We also have a question from Medina. Medina is asking, what are organizations such as OIE, World Animal Protection, doing to ensure that animal keepers, animal enthusiasts are aware of this farm animal welfare standards?
Again, a very good question from Medina. What I'd like to say is that OIE working with Africa Union Interbureau for Animal Resources, AUIBA as it's called, have developed certain things. For instance, in Africa, we now have an animal welfare strategy that has been ratified by the 54 heads of states, which is the legal document that we're using to drive animal welfare across the continent. The process is that various countries are now then developing their own standards or legislation that then addresses that. In terms of OIE and AUABA and the government developing some of these things, I think it's what World Animal Protection is trying to do is part of what is known as education and mobilization, is to educate and make the general public aware that standards are available. Where they are stuck and there are still challenges is for the general public to then join us in driving to ensure that government then produces the right legislation. I'll give you a good example. In this country, we are now going through a review of the Kenya, it's known as Protection of Cruelty Act, CAP 360. And we've developed a new bill known as the Animal Welfare and Protection Bill. That bill needs to be pushed through Parliament around all the things that are happening. And those are some of the places where Kenyans can then join, or the general public can join in driving that process. I know the same process is happening in other countries like Uganda. Tanzania is slightly ahead because they have an animal welfare bill that is slightly ahead. But there are two things that we then need to look at. One is education and awareness so that people are aware, but also to mobilize so that the right systems and regulations or policies are put in place. Thank you.
All right, Victor, we also have a question from Joanne Magero. She's asking if globally there's a certifying body for all these global companies that you've just mentioned in the business benchmark for farm animal welfare.
Thank you, John. Globally, there are various bodies that actually are standardized or certify. But what I know is that certification is driven by governments. So if I wanted to be certified, there is a process that I go through in terms of the Kenyan government having certain things, working with the Kenya Bureau of Standards. There are also global organizations that do certain certifications. I know Bureau Veritas is one of them. Whether they have animal welfare incorporated into some of those things is something that World Animal Protection is engaging them, because I know we've done animal welfare audits for some of these organizations. I also know that there are organizations like RSPCA in London that also do standardization. So there are processes. I think what we then need to do is to harmonize them and be able to direct certain companies to certain places. If you look at some of the companies that we've listed in the current BBFAW report, you will see that a good chunk of them also work with independent auditors who help them to understand where they are in terms of animal welfare and helps them to develop animal welfare policies and practices within the system. If you read at the tail end of the report, the report that is being launched, the full report, you'll see various mentions of auditing companies, of certifying bodies that are then working with the industry to develop some of these policies and regulations. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Victor. There's another question from Bikorading, and Bikorading is asking if KFC in Africa is adherent to the standards that are observed by the parent company in other continents such as Europe and the US.
Good question from Biko, and I think I alluded to that in the presentation that I made when I said that various franchises are at different spaces. For instance, in Europe, the European franchises of KFC have then aligned themselves with the Better Chicken commitment. In Kenya or in Africa, that is something that you're still looking at, and you're having discussion with the relevant bodies in terms of KFC. So part of what we do as an organization is then to engage them and then work with them in developing some of these things. And where they are lacking, like in Africa, is engage KFC Africa, the franchise holder, and work with them to ensure that they then meet international standards. I also think that's part of the reason why we are launching this report today, is for you as a consumer to then also help us in asking and holding international companies that are working in our markets accountable. And it's for you to then ask them the same questions you're asking. If they have a commitment in Europe, why is the commitment not being extended into Africa or Asia or the other markets that they're operating in? So it's a two-pronged thing. One is asking you as consumers to be part of the supporters that drive that process. But the second thing is also then working with them, and World Animal Protection is available to work with them, and we are working with some of them to develop some of these policies and legislation that is required to ensure that then they confirm or make the same commitments in this market. Yeah.
All right, Victor, we also have another question asking with the way things are, all these global companies are coming into the African market, and we have the African policies as they are. Just how should African markets prepare themselves for future situations? We have all these global companies coming in, our policies are as they are, and the situation is just as it is. Just what should governments and people do to ensure that the worst of farm animal welfare does not reach in our market?
Thank you for that question. Again, I think that two ways we need to look at it. One is that animal welfare has become ingrained as part of the international to trade across countries or across regional blocks. One of the things that we can easily look at is what regulations or requirements are in place. For instance, if I look at what we are looking at in farm animal welfare, transportation, how we're transporting animals becomes important, because the international OIE has developed certain international standards around which we need to be looking at how far the animal can travel. If it's traveling far, how do we manage that process? It's a business decision, and it's a trade issue that governments need to put in place. The second thing we need to be looking at is the use of antibiotics is another example of growth promoters. Certain blocks of countries are banning consumption of antibiotics and looking at residues. So I think it's behold that we are in to ensure that we are that meet international requirements, that ensure that the well-being of the animal is catered for, that ensures that the animal has its fundamental freedoms catered for. Does it have enough space? Yeah, for instance, if you look at Europe right now, they have said that spacing, you should not put more than 30 kilograms per meter squared in terms of chickens. Where is Africa in this? And that's one of the challenges as an organization we are trying to address, and BBFAW is helping us to address, about ensuring that we have standards, we have policies in place, either as countries or as regional economic blocks that then drive the trade, so that if I want to trade with Africa, or if I want to bring products into Africa, or if my franchise is sitting in Africa, how am I ensuring that these processes are catered for and the animal welfare is put at the forefront of that business? That is what BBFAW is basically trying to drive.
All right, and we are heading to the last two questions. And the first one is, what collective action should be done by people who are actively in the animal welfare sector, professionals such as vets, for example? What is their role in all of this, just to ensure that farm animal welfare standards are upheld in Africa?
Thank you. I think for vets, the important thing to appreciate is that anything that a vet does is animal welfare, because it goes towards delivery of the 5 freedoms. Yeah. If the vet recommends a certain food or advises the farmer how to feed the animal, that is important. If the vet is looking at vaccinations and disease control, that caters for fundamental number 3. If the vet is looking at spacing and housing, and in this case, it's not only vets, but also the animal production professionals. The critical thing to understand is that everything that we do is about, we must be to cater for that animal, because a well-catered animal then performs better. And I think a lot of us are missing the connection, because we are not able to connect the performance and the quality of the product that gets onto our table without the animal is handled. It is now scientifically proven that a poor handled animal will underperform and will also give you poor quality products. And so my urge to vets is to look at the farm holistically. It's not just about treating, it's also about the food that the animal feeds on. It's also about the environment. Is it a clean environment? Is it got good ventilation so that the animal is not having any challenges with the breathing? So essentially, beyond that, then the vets must drive the process of ensuring that you have the relevant regulation and laws in place. I've also alluded to the fact that because companies are beginning to understand the importance of animal welfare, they're beginning to engage more animal welfare professionals into their businesses. And that's an opportunity for vets to then, or animal production experts to then drive certain aspects of animal welfare to ensure that we then raise the standards of the welfare of farm animals in Africa or wherever the markets that we're operating in.
All right, thank you, Victor. The last question is, there are countries in the globe that have better animal welfare standards than other countries, and maybe African countries can pick lessons from that. So if you were to give a number of lessons that we can pick from countries doing well, what would you say would be those lessons? Hello, Victor, are you with us? Looks like we lost Victor, but we've come to the end of our Q&A session. And just before we end this webinar, we'll put up a 2-question poll. Kindly do
I think
answer.
I'll take it country by country and region. The other end are now trying to come back, look at what is happening back into small, bigger.
Victor, are you with us? You got lost for a minute there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Are you ready to take the last question?
I am ready. I was even taking it.
Good. All right. Maybe we need to hear from the top because we lost you for a minute.
Well, I was saying that the question is about things that we can learn from other species that as Africans. I think there are certain innovations that are out there that we need to look at. In the last 2 or 3 years as World Animal Protection, as we have participated in exhibitions and trade fairs, that are being banned or rejected in the development. Very careful to ensure that they are not going where they're coming into Africa, but it's banned elsewhere, crossing into Africa. But those again are banned. I don't know what is happening.
Can you hear me, Victor?
Yes, I can, Beth.
Yeah, I think you are breaking, but you can try once more before we conclude the session.
Okay, I'll make it brief and just say that Africa should be very careful that banned innovation or practices coming from the rest of the world is not dumped into Africa. And I was giving 2 examples. Battery cage systems have been banned in Europe, but we're slowly seeing them coming into Africa. And they're even being funded. And part of what the organization is doing is to look where this funding is coming from to ensure that the money coming from Europe or those markets are not being used to support a process that has been banned elsewhere. The second thing we are looking at, which I think Africa needs to be aware of, we are moving into slow-growing breeds, especially in birds. And we need to, as Africa, start thinking through the process of how we then manage that with the limitations of our production systems. The last one, which I want to allude to, is the fact that we're also seeing things like farrowing paints being brought into Africa, where organizations are trying to move into farrowing pens, but it's been banned elsewhere. And so I think the danger for us as Africa is then to do a quick study and understand what is being banned, what is affecting the welfare of the farm animals negatively, and how then can we manage that to ensure that it doesn't get into our production systems, while we are still driving to ensure that our production systems remain as high welfare as possible, with the limitation of small-scale farmers as part of that process. But I think it's something that is doable if industry, government, and key players come together. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Victor, for taking the time to answer the participants' question. If your question did not get a chance to be answered in this session, we'll endeavor to get back to you after this. Kindly continue sending in your questions via the email that sent you the registration details to this webinar. Just before we close, we'd like to apologize for the technical hitches that have been experienced at the beginning and sometimes during this session. We'll endeavor to improve on this in future webinars, and we urge you to kindly attend and walk this journey of animal welfare with us. We want to put up a poll for about a minute. Kindly take the time to answer the questions, and then after that you can leave at your own pleasure. If you're a media stakeholder, we urge you to stay behind. Victor will have a 15-minute session with you so that you can ask any burning question that you may have, and after that we'll end this session. Thank you all for attending. I'm sharing the results to the first poll we had at the beginning. 80% of you said that they think there's a link between animal welfare and your health, and that is correct. Whatever you eat has a direct impact on your health. And on question 2, 72% of you said that neither of what is listed is one of animal welfare violations. As Victor mentioned, instances such as raising chicken in cages is a violation of animal welfare. Giving animals antibiotics to facilitate their growth is also a violation of animal welfare, and also mixing animals in one space. 77% of you said that you are aware of existing animal protection laws in your country. So thank you all for participating. At this point, we'll move on to the journalist session. For journalists, we'll allow you to ask your questions verbally. So please raise your hand if you have any question, and we'll allow you to talk. Biko? Hello? Hello, Biko?
Okay.
If you have any questions, kindly raise your hand and we'll give you an opportunity to speak.
Beth is managing the process. I can see 3 participants have raised their hands.
Austin, are you there? Would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, please.
All right. Please
Yeah.
take
Hi,
it on.
Victor. Can I ask my question?
Hi, Austin.
Good afternoon and greetings from Tanzania. Thank you for the wonderful presentation and congratulations on the progress so far from our last discussion. You've answered exhaustively 2 of my questions, but if I may re-ask, or if I may ask again my last question, which was actually the last question of the session, what are some of the key lessons that we can actually draw from many countries that you've mentioned, mostly European countries, which have far advanced in animal protection? I think this is one of the lessons that we would really wish, you know, countries like Tanzania, countries in East Africa to learn, that we may adopt into our own terms. So what are some of the lessons that, you know, European countries or we can draw from European countries, so that we may able to internalize in our context, so that we may actually be able to sail in the same wavelength? Thank you.
Thank you, Austin, for the question. It's unfortunate that when I was addressing it, we got cut off with challenges for technology. What I'd like to say is that Europe and North Americans have done very extremely intensive farming systems, what we call industrial farming. They have now realized that that system does not necessarily work, and they're now coming back where Africa is. And one of the things I was alluding to is that Africa needs to be very careful not to get themselves where Europe or the developed world is. And I was giving examples. For instance, stocking density has been an issue. And if you look at the presentation, one of the big things we are looking at is stocking density. Europe has gone to a level where we can put up to 42 kilos per meter squared in a chicken house. But they're realizing that that has challenges, because the chicken then suffers from challenges with its growth rates, challenges with its health. And so they're now reducing and coming back to almost where Africa is. And the European law now says that you should maximum is 30 kilos per meter squared. So that's one good example of things we need to be looking at. We're also looking at things like innovations like battery cage systems, which have been banned across the European market or in North America. And you can see they're even saying that by 2023, we will not be allowing people to, they will not be allowing battery cage system produced eggs into their production system. Again, there's a reason why, because that space is too small, doesn't allow the bird to perform and to meet its fundamental freedoms. And that's why they're now saying, let's go back to deep litter system or something like that. Same applies to pigs. If you look at farrowing pens, which have recently in Dar es Salaam and in Nairobi and somewhere in Uganda, I've seen farrowing pens being exhibited so that African farmers can start using them. But the challenge then is they have limitations and they do not cater for the welfare of the animal. And I think people or the world is beginning to realize that if you treat the animals well, then they produce better. If you mishandle the animals, then you end up with challenges. So I think that is something that we need to continue looking at as production people, as people in the media. Let's start talking about some of these things to ensure that we finally end up with a system that works and we do not blindly follow where Europe or the developed world is coming from. I hope that answers you, Makani.
Thank you so much, Victor. Maybe I will ask a follow-up question later with regards to your presentation, especially on dumping, but let me allow other people to ask questions as well.
Oh, okay.
All right, thank you, Austin. I can see Ronald, you have lifted your hand. Ronald, do you have a question? Ronald? All right, Julia, you have a question?
Hello?
Hello, Ronald, do you have a question?
Yes, are you getting me?
Yes, we can get you, Ronald.
Okay, unfortunately, I came late in the webinar about the animal welfare. Okay. For me, Africa has not really grasped animal welfare, particularly the 5 freedoms of animal welfare. You can remember that the 5 freedoms of animal welfare originated from intensively kept animals, in which Professor Bramble was asked to investigate, and he came up with this 5 freedoms. So the 5 freedom was from intensively kept animals. And that is why you see the developing world have already done very well. But for Africa, I see that the 5 freedom is not applicable to Africa, and to particularly developing countries. So my question is, how can developing countries with a free range system of animal management incorporate the 5 freedoms of animal welfare, where our animals will also have similar protection from like the ones in the developed world?
Thank you, Ronald, for that question.
Yeah.
I tend to agree with you to an extent that we might not have ingrained the 5 freedoms well. Yes, but you also must appreciate the fact that Africa is now beginning to start intensive farming systems, and we have very big producers on this planet, on this continent. So it behoves and it's critical that we ensure that all those 5 freedoms are then catered for effectively. I know we have challenges. If you look at the African context, we have challenges with the quality of feed, which then speaks into freedom number 1. I also know we have challenges with the kind of housing, especially in the small scale production systems, poor ventilation, poor hygiene, which then also speaks to freedom number 3, sorry. So essentially what we are trying to say is that even as we move our farmers along, we must cater for the 5 freedoms. We must incorporate them. It does not, from where I sit, it does not matter whether it is an intensive system or it's the system that you're talking about out there in a free range system. Even in a free range system, the bird needs to get proper diet. It needs to be having proper, good quality water. The housing or where the environment that it runs around it must be free from discomfort. It must be an environment that caters for the need of that bird or the animal that you are looking at. Ultimately, that environment must also be at a level where it's not causing injury or pain to the animal. And it's not allowing the animals to get into disease situations. And that is why you look at things like biosecurity, hygiene, vaccinations. So essentially, while we might say that Africa has not ingrained it, or our intensive farming system is not there, I think we still need to critically analyze and ensure that the 5 freedoms are catered for and the animals have their needs being met if they're going to improve productivity. And remember, productivity is then linked to livelihoods and food security from an African perspective. So these things are not just things that are being done in Europe or the developed world, but are things that the developing world must take cognizance in. And that's why as World Animal Protection, we work in the developing world and look at some of these things and help the industry and governments to drive that process to ensure that the relevant policies, regulations are in place that then helps the animal and the animal needs are catered for. I hope that helps you or clarifies the point, Roland.
Roland, does that clarify? Roland? Okay. Julia, you had a question. Are you there? Julia? Bikorading, do you have a question? Would you like to go?
Oh yeah, no problem. Put me on.
You're on.
Okay, Victor.
Hi, Biko.
Hi, how are you? I just want to find out, how can we control commercial farming in Africa and especially in Kenya to ensure food safety and also animal welfare? Because this has been a major issue, especially to household farmers. That's all.
Good question, Biko. I think there are various things we can do, and some of them are constitutional. And I think the challenge we are having is that we have not even read and ingrained that constitution. The constitution of Kenya, the one that we ratified in 2010, gives certain roles and responsibilities around animal welfare to the two principal governments. National government is supposed to be looking at matters relating to policy, especially around protection of animals. If you look at Schedule 4, while county government is supposed to be looking at veterinary services, it's supposed to be looking at for at certain levels. So I think part of it is a constitutional thing that we need to work with counties, and that's what World Animal Protection is trying to do, to work with county and national government to ensure that the environment that the animals are being produced in is having the right policies and the right regulations in place. In terms of working with industry, we're also trying to ensure that industry then is clear on industry standards, and that's why we engage industry. Well, that's why we're looking at the BBFAW, for instance, today, that engages producers, restaurants, and retailers. And that's where I think the next where consumers then become critical, because if you're going to buy meat across the 4 African countries to look at what we found that consumers are buying, the biggest place where consumers buy meat is a butchery. But butchery is the place where they most distrust. So it was an oxymoron. We buy meat from the person we most distrust. And those are some of the things we are trying to then engage the public on. And that's part of the reason why we do presentations like this and talk to media, because we need to up the understanding of the general public, the connection between how the animal is raised and ultimately what comes out as a product, and whether that product is holistic or is going to have negative things that have challenges with us. And I'm sure in the last few months, you've seen some of the things that are being discussed by TV, some of your colleagues. A good example is talk about aflatoxins being in the system. Why is it getting into the system? It's because we do not understand the connection between feeding pork on our table. So I think there are challenges, but there's opportunities to then pick the discussion, and as World Animal Protection, we want to be part of that discussion that then encourages the consumer to ask the hard questions. The farmer is then going to be pushed to then look at high welfare production systems, and ultimately then we should have a better production system that then ensures that what comes out at the end is good quality product. But also remember that there are also government institutions that charged with certain responsibilities. Kenya Bureau of Standards should be looking at the standards of feed that we feed, the quality of meat that comes out, the milk that comes out. And these are some of the discussions that we need to be looking at if we are going to drive the welfare of the animals to the next level. I hope that answers you, Biko.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Biko. Clifford, you had a question. Would you like to come on? Clifford?
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes. The issue of dog culling. I wanted Daktari to talk about the issue of dog culling in the light of animal welfare.
Hi, Victor. Do we still have you on? Clifford, let's wait for Victor to get back on.
Although today we were talking about farm animal welfare, I will address the issue. Dog culling is an old disappeared. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
There I am.
Clifford, did you get your feedback?
No, I think Daktari's connection is not good.
All right.
Yeah.
Maybe this will be a good place to end. We had about 15 minutes to run the question and answer with you. Clifford, I will request Daktari to pick up your question after this session. Should you have any other questions, kindly write to the email that sent you the registration details to join this webinar.
Can you hear
Otherwise,
me?
thank you.
He's
Okay.
back, yeah.
Yeah, please come back, Victor.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, Clifford, let's take it again. I was saying that while we had, the law allowed us to cull animal.
Yeah.
Are you hearing me, Clifford?
You are breaking. Yeah, I'm hearing you now.
Okay, if you can hear me, what I was saying is that traditionally we were allowed to cull animals, dogs, because of the Rabies Control Act. However, science has now shown that culling dogs does not solve the problem. Because when you cull those dogs, one, you're using a product called strict. Secondly, the animals, when they are culled and removed from that situation they are in, you've basically created a vacuum, which other dogs will move. So within 6 to 9 months, another level of other dogs will have come. So the solution is to look at the whole thing holistically. And holistically, then we have what is called dog population management, which is about ensuring that the dogs are catered for so that they do not roam. Remember the 5 freedoms that we are talking about. If the dog is fed well, it is kept in a comfortable environment, it is vaccinated properly, it is allowed space to run so that it expresses its normal behavior, and it's not being mishandled so that it's in a state of fear and distress, that dog will most likely be at home and will not be running around, which is what causes the problem of stray dogs that ultimately needs to be culled. So that's one level. The other level is looking at the management of those dogs. The dogs in places like where they become stray, how do we manage that population? Can we do quote unquote family planning by spaying and neutering the dog so that you still have the dog in place, but it is not able to reproduce? Those are some of the things that we need to be looking at. And there's a whole process around dog population management that I can refer you to our expert on that, or my colleagues who handle animals in communities, to give you more details if you wanted to follow up on that. But it's something that also looks at environment. The other thing we need to look at is the environment, how we are disposing waste, because a lot of stray dogs are found where either we are throwing medical waste, or where hotel waste is being thrown. So again, there's environmental management that needs to be looked at in that process. I hope that gives you some indication, Clifford.
Yes, yes. Maybe you could share experts you are talking about later. I can follow up with them.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Victor, for taking the time to answer those media questions. And thank you for everyone who has attended this and has asked relevant questions to get clarification on animal welfare issues. You can still ask questions even after this, like I said, through the email that sent you the registration details to this webinar. Otherwise, this will be a good time to wrap it up, and I hope you will become animal welfare ambassadors in your own capacity. Thank you so much.